Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for our webinar, Using Tools to Predict Your Nonprofit or Association's Future. First up, we have Trista Harris today. We're delighted to have Trista. She's the president of the Minnesota Council on Foundations, and she's also a philanthropic futurist when her work has been highlighted by Forbes, CNN, the New York Times, the Chronicle of Philanthropy. She's an international speaker on using tools of futurism to solve society's present challenges. And Trista's Minnesota Council on Foundations is a vibrant community of grant makers who award more than $1.5 billion annually. So very impressive stuff there, and Trista is a real treat to have on board today. I'm Anne Dermody. I'm the Director of Content Marketing here at CQ Roll Call. Then I'm going to follow Trista, and I'll talk about looking at a couple of advocacy tools that you might already have or you might be thinking about exploring that will help you to predict at least some of the kind of near future things that you're concerned about, and it'll help you get folks engaged and maybe help you grow your base in ways that you mightn't have thought of. So that's about it. Let's kick it off now by going over to Trista.
Thanks, Anne. I'm so excited to be here with you today. So I'm Trista Harris, and one of the passions that I brought to my work is futurism. My belief is that you can't just be flexible when change comes, that you really have to anticipate the change that's coming and then prepare for it before it happens. Because a problem can be an opportunity if you can see it well before it lands on your doorstep. So how do you do this? You've got to take some time to look for the signs that are currently out there. And this skill is especially important for people that are working in the public policy space because, as you know, change can happen really, really quickly in that space. So even in this rapidly changing policy environment, we can see signals of what the future is going to bring. Your neighbor purchasing a Tesla, a small city that's banning plastic shopping bags, the Livable Cities movement, all of these are examples of the future in action, but right now. So learning to notice these changes is critical to helping your organizations become more future-focused so that you can both predict and shape the future. Now, for the baby boomers in the audience, some of you may remember the 1960s as a time where, as a nation, we spent a lot of time being really excited about the future. The space program, modernist design, even the Jetsons were all really positive views of what the future would look like. I was really positive that by now I would have a Rosie robot in my house that would clean everything and cook for me, and now we just have a little Roomba that bounces around and vacuums the floor. But since that time, our view of the future has gotten a lot more negative. So in popular media, from things like The Hunger Games or The Matrix or even the cartoon WALL-E, where the planet was destroyed by garbage and all of us were obese in outer space, we've started to treat the future like it's something terrible that's coming towards us rather than something that we create. And I think that we've also started to believe as a society that we can't possibly understand what the future holds. And I think that's complete and utter nonsense. So for people that work to make the world and our communities a better place, we really have to be future-wise. And it's much easier than you think. So just 3 simple steps, if you practice them consistently, will help you both predict and shape the futures of our communities. So these 3 steps may seem pretty familiar because they are the same thing that your mother told you as you were riding your bike in the neighborhood or crossing the street. To be more future-wise, you need to stop, look, and then go. So I'll walk you through each of these steps. And as we're talking, think about what this means for your practices in your organizations and what it means for your day-to-day work. So what does it take for you as a change maker within your organization to be more future-wise? It's a great skill set for you to be able to bring into institutions. So this first step is stop, and this is about stop loving the problem. So I bet a ton of you sit in the same sort of meetings that I do where you spend a ton of time and energy thinking about how terrible everything is. So you want the statistics about the problem, and you think about the problem a lot, and you want to get as much detail as possible about the problem. But while knowing the scope of the issue you're working on is helpful, it for sure cannot be the end, and you can't use up all your energy as a professional on this idea of what are all the things that are broken. because it can be really counterproductive to spend all your time on that spot. So often the solution is to not think more deeply about the existing problem, it's to skip the problem altogether. So I'll give you an example. For many years, both government and philanthropists were concerned about the electrical and telecommunications infrastructure that's needed for sub-Saharan Africa. That sort of infrastructure is very expensive to put in place and to maintain, but it's really critical to quality of life. And so it became this issue area that there'd be lots of conferences and meetings and conversations and foundations thinking about how to invest and governments thinking about how to invest, but really it was too big of a problem to solve. Now that problem was completely skipped. The mobile telephone network, which specializes in providing phone services to emerging markets, they bring electricity with them as they expand in the form of generators that are used as charging stations. And what you see in this photo is a Maasai man who in his hand holds a bank, a personal computer, access to market prices, education, and a healthcare diagnosis. And that cell phone, he has more access to information in his hand than President Bill Clinton did. The problem wasn't building the infrastructure, it was making sure that the communities had access to the benefits of the infrastructure. So sometimes the problem that we're focused on isn't the problem at all, so you can completely skip it. So for yourself, as you're thinking about the problems that you care about personally or the issues that your organizations are working on, what would it actually look like if the problem was completely solved? If it wasn't a problem anymore, how would the world be different? How would people's day-to-days feel different? And as you imagine that sort of preferred future that you have for this problem, does that help you start to identify new solutions? Can you get to a new direction to solve the problem if you start from a completely different space? So the next step is look, and look is about looking for current signals. You can't just be flexible when that change comes. You need to anticipate it and prepare for it before it happens, because the world is moving too quickly, and we're unable, once the change has already happened, to change our directions and our strategic plans and all of those sort of things, because then there's a new issue that you need to be addressing. So how do we start to do this? Well, you've got to make time to look at the signs that are currently out there. So here's some ways that you can do that in your day-to-day work. Set aside 5% of your time for research and development. Too often we don't think about what R&D looks like in our organizations. Now, if you talk to somebody at General Mills about not investing in research and development, they would think that you're crazy. It's the only way that companies can grow, when you're paying attention to what's coming next. But in the social sector and in the government sector, we often don't have those conversations as often. And so how do we make sure that we are setting aside time in our schedule for paying attention to what's happening between 5 and 50 years in the future? So during that time, you can pay attention to trends that are happening in your field. I bet many of you have a pile of newsletters and magazines and a computer full of interesting articles that you've been planning to read for a long time. Setting aside just a couple hours a week to actually look at those things allows you to understand what's happening within your sector or your part of the field. It's even more important to pay attention to innovations that are happening outside of your field, but that may have use in your field. So a way that I try to do this is if I'm stuck with a problem and I'm trying to get to the bottom of it, I will pick a random TED Talk, one that's been high rated and people have really enjoyed. I'll watch it, and then I'll try to figure out, well, is there something about this idea that's within this TED Talk that might be useful as I'm trying to solve this problem? So for my organization, we were doing some program planning and how to share programs with our membership. And as I was kind of stuck with the idea of how to make it more useful for many more of our members, I watched a TED Talk that was about the power of introverts. And that allowed me to think about some new solutions that really kept in mind that not every single one of the people that comes to our program wants to speak up and wants to sort of have an extroverted experience. So TED Talks can be a great resource as you're thinking about different ideas and different ways to move forward. So here's another example of how we've done this in the policy space. So there was a lot of confusion after the 2016 presidential election, and organizations were unsure what a changing federal landscape would mean and how that would influence their work. That happens anytime there's a new president. You have to figure out, well, does our strategy actually work for new people that are in charge? And so to help the organizations that we work with move from confusion to action, we developed 4 scenarios of how the changing federal landscape would influence local nonprofit areas, since that's an area that we work in. Now, first what we did to create these scenarios is we had to hold national conditions stable. And that means that we just had to do our best estimate of what would happen federally. And the estimations that we had is that there would be an increased investment in local businesses. There would probably be a decrease in taxes. There would probably be a change or a decrease in government bureaucracy. We also had some signals that there would be changes in the Affordable Health Care Act, a decrease in racial and civil rights protections, and then changes in immigration laws, especially for Muslim and Latino communities. So this was our estimate in November about what those national conditions may have looked like. Some of that is held strong through the last couple of months. But what we were very unsure about is what were the local variables going to look like. So if we don't know if local government is going to match what's happening at the federal level, which they sometimes do, or if they'll do the opposite. So if you have a federal government that is interested in decreasing the federal bureaucracy, what that often means is that there is a decrease in human services funding for nonprofit organizations, which is a space where many of our foundations are funding. We also don't know if other foundations are going to keep giving 5% of their assets to grants, or if they're going to increase that giving to 6% to meet emerging needs. So those were big questions, and I think for many people, they were really unsure of what's the direction of both the local and the national. So what scenario planning allows you to do is just imagine what some of those possibilities are. So we took all of those different local possibilities, holding those federal possibilities really steady, and said, okay, most likely there are 4 options. Either local government funding, local government will increase human services funding and foundation funding will stay steady, or maybe there'll be an increase in foundation funding and local government will decrease their funding. And in each of these 4 scenarios, you look at how those 2 different variables are interacting with each other. So for example, if local government increased their human services funding and foundations kept their funding steady, that might mean that there needs to be more training for government grant makers about how to make an effective grant making within the human services space. If foundation funding stayed steady and there was a decrease in local human services funding, and we'd estimate also a decrease in funding from the federal government, then that would be a time where we'd expect the nonprofit sector to do more with less. So there are needs that are there, but there's less funding for that to happen. So by doing this activity, and we did the sort of thing where everybody had Post-it notes and was coming up to the wall and sort of guessing what it meant for their organization, for the issues in the sectors that they cared about, what you start to see is trends across different parts of these quadrants. So for us, what we found out is that in all 4 scenarios, there was an increased interest in volunteerism, an increased interest in mission and program-related investments, and then an increased interest in learning about the public policy process from the foundation side. So that helped us as an organization start to adjust where we were spending our staff time and what sort of expertise that we needed to have on the staff side to make sure that we could meet these emerging needs. So sometimes looking at those federal conditions, but understanding what might be different on the local level allows you to do some planning even before things are figured out. So if your organization then comes up with 4 sort of mini strategic plans, and then you know which one to pull out once it's really clear which one of these futures is coming true. This last step is about go, and it's trying things out. It's about not being nervous about what's coming next in the future because you're trying new things. So the best way to predict the future is to create it. And I know for many of us that we forget that we really have a lot of agency about what the future looks like, especially the space that many of you are working on. The influences that you have in public policy and within your institutions really creates a completely different future for our community. So making sure that we take advantage of that ability is especially important. Now, this is one of my favorite quotes about the future. We need to try new things to get breakthroughs, and being willing to experiment and try new things is really what leads to some pretty exciting innovation. So this means that we need to learn to fail faster, which is for sure counterintuitive. And many of you may be thinking, I'm working on critical community issues. It is not okay to fail. It's not okay to let communities down or to let families down in this process. But the part that I think that we often forget is we're already letting communities down because we haven't gotten to the bottom of some pretty important systemic issues. And I think one of the reasons that we haven't gotten to the bottom of those issues is because we're really nervous about what failure looks like. So implementing new ideas and ways of working on the issues that you care about is really an important skill set, and we need more of those change makers to exist within organizations to be willing to bring forward new ideas and new solutions. Some of the things that you identified in that look step really can be great opportunities for your organizations to move forward a lot faster than peers. Could you try a new idea in a certain part of your program? Could you try multiple ideas in different places to figure out some of the ideas that you have for change, to figure out, should we do it this way or should we do it this way? What's the difference that we see in program success if we try different things? And then what's the very minimum model that you need to get started? You know, sometimes we want to have a big fancy plan and everything to be completely figured out before we were willing to put that first foot forward. And I think for many of us, sometimes you just have to do it. You have to try something. You have to kind of jump out and test it and be willing to land on your face every once in a while when stuff doesn't work. And you have to share with what you're learning both with your institution and with your field, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So for many of us, we love to share our successes, obviously, and talk to peers in the field when things work really well. But I think it's even more important to share when things don't work so that a similar organization can take your learnings and then move it forward in a different direction. And then they can report back to the field and say, well, we tried this and here's what worked. As across whole sectors, we really need to have a lot more conversation about what's working and what's not working. And most importantly, I think we can't be afraid of failure. So I know that people we're sort of genetically programmed to be worried about failing on the things that we work on, but we need to start to get to the place where we're willing to say, hey, we tried it, here's the thing that we learned, and here's what didn't work. And within our institutions, I've heard some great examples of a couple of consulting firms that for each employee, they have, here's the things that you're great at, and here are the growth areas that you have, and we're going to consistently talk about both of those things, that you can become really excellent in the things that you're already good at, but so that you can make sure that the things that you don't do as well don't become a sticking point for you, and you're able to improve those enough that they don't become a barrier. So let's move to the place where it's okay to have those sort of conversations, and our feelings don't get as hurt as we're talking about that, because I think that's the only way to create innovation and change within the organizations that we work in and with the issues that we care about. So my question for you is, what strategies are you going to start to implement to become more future-wise? Are you going to start to get some of your news media from new places to get new perspectives? Will you set aside that 5% time for R&D within your organization to read some of that pile of reports that you have available? Are you willing to experiment and try new things within a small part of your work or within your larger work? And will you be willing to be that voice and that change agent within your institutions to make sure that we're getting lots of voices in the sector talking about what's coming next in the future and helping us to move forward? my worry for the field is that we're going through a time of exponential change where the ways that the economy works and the ways that education works and even the ways that families and communities work are all really being changed by rapid increases in technology. And so how do we make sure that we're becoming the sort of organizations and people that are willing to talk about those changes, to talk about what increases in robotics might mean for organizations and our issues to care about, what self-driving cars might mean for how we build cities. If we're not talking about the future, then some of these changes just come and we're completely unprepared for it. And people are not made for times of exponential change. We're really kind of DNA wired to be people that live on a prairie and go hunt and gather our food and live with small groups of people, and that's as far as your scope goes. We're now a globally connected people. That's something that happens on the other side of the world really impacts us, and we hear about it almost instantaneously. And so we've got to start to build up both resiliency and expertise about the future, and to make sure that we can help our organizations do the same, because the issues that you're working on and the issues that you care about are so important. So you can continue to stay in touch with me at tristaharris.com, or on Twitter I'm at Trista Harris. I often write about what's happening next in the future and what that means for people that do good for a living or that care about important issues in the community, and so you can stay connected that way. Thank you so much for having me today.
Fabulous. Thank you, Trista. So Trista talked a bit there about experimentation and failing faster in order to succeed sooner, and that's kind of a good segue into our next slide here, because it shows us kind of how necessity has often become the mother of invention for some of our greatest leaps forward. And that's true with advocacy, maybe surprisingly so too. Advocacy and innovation tends to kind of come when there's a lot on the line, when big things are at stake. And often innovation at that level gives the rest of us this trickle-down set of tools that we can use later on. So that's never more true in the years of a presidential election. And to kind of make that point, I'd ask you to remember all the big things that got invented that ended up being something else. And so, for instance, Coca-Cola, one of the world's obviously most famous brands, that was originally invented as an alternative to morphine addiction, of all things, and to treat headaches and relieve anxiety. Listerine was invented 135 years ago now, and that was first marketed as a kind of surgical antiseptic and a treatment for, above all things, sweaty feet and soft corns developing between the toes. Lovely. And then over the next century, it got marketed as a refreshing additive to cigarettes, a cure for the common cold, and also as a dandruff treatment. Of course, then eventually it found its home, its current home, back in the 1920s when it became a cure for bad breath. Bubble wrap, I kind of love this one. It started its life as textured wallpaper and failed miserably. And it wasn't until IBM started using it to keep their fragile items safe in transport that it found its current kind of home, not to mention the fact that it's also incredibly useful for alleviating stress when you press those bubbles. And then GPS navigation. Russia obviously has been in the news a lot recently, but the GPS navigation that you have on your phone now was all kind of thanks to Sputnik back in the day. So all of these things are just a kind of more amusing way to put the idea in your heads that for those of us in advocacy or government relations, you'll know that presidential election campaigns have this way of pushing things forward in the whole industry. And you know, you have this huge surge of money and investment once every 4 years, kind of focused on getting people riled up to go out and vote for candidates. So inevitably, there's this trickle-down effect in terms of the tools and the tactics that get used for advocacy. And that's particularly true if you look at the 2008 presidential election. A lot of folks may think of President Trump as sort of the Twitter kingpin for elections, but that movement was actually started by then presidential candidate Barack Obama back in 2008. And digital political campaigns have come a long way in just those 2 election cycles. Back in 2008, when then Senator Barack Obama was starting to run or announced his run, he was kind of spurred by this relatively new social media platform, Twitter, and that kind of changed the game forever. You know, if you think back to 2008, the iPhone was only a year old, Twitter was not much older, and the use of technology in that campaign really kind of energized and targeted young grassroots voters, and it was paramount really to going door to door for that age group that turned out to be critical to President Obama's win. So all of that is something we now kind of take for granted in our advocacy tools. You know, it's not surprising to any of us that we can tweet Congress or you know, go on candidates' Facebook pages, but back then that concept just really did not exist, and it's been pretty revolutionary for advocacy. But to bring that all forward to the most recent presidential election, we saw more kind of huge leaps forward, and particularly thanks to the campaigns of Bernie Sanders and Ted Cruz. Now, I don't have to point out, obviously, that Bernie and Ted didn't actually win the election, but the tools and the tactics that they used were probably the most interesting in terms of technology and what that means for advocacy going forward. So to look a little at the methods that they employed, well, let's look at this term we constantly hear about now, big data, and how that's being used in ways we're sort of vaguely aware of, whether it's someone gathering information that we're looking at about what we're looking at online or what we're buying or what we're watching or streaming and so on, and how that's kind of being fed to marketers or businesses to predict how we'll likely behave and what actions we're going to take in a buying situation. Well, that's equally true in advocacy. So a lot of prediction starts with gathering data or determining how people are going to act. And that sounds difficult on the face of it because humans would seem to be these sort of wavering, indecisive animals, but actually we're not. We're highly predictable. And the more data you can have on someone's behavior, the better able you're going to be to predict how they're going to act in the future. And that's what Bernie Sanders and Ted Cruz's campaigns got very good at doing through the tools they used during the election. And that's kind of what you can use too now. And one way that they did that was through this notion of gamification, where they got supporters to give more information, more data through games, and you could win points for taking action. I think it was Ted Cruz's app, for example, scored you different points for door-to-door canvassing. You got 1,000 points, I think, for every knock, or you earned 50 points if you reminded your friends to vote in the primaries. Likewise, on Bernie Sanders' app, users would get points for knocking on doors, and then they could triple those points if they entered the information about what the household said. So they could click on these 5 options after they'd knocked on the door, from strongly against Bernie Sanders to undecided to strongly in favor of him. And that way the campaign was drawing all this data so they could see up where to shore up resources or where not to waste them. Users, of course, were also asked to sign in using a Facebook account or an email, and that allowed the campaign see who your friends were, who would probably be more likely to vote in a similar way to you. And so all this sort of valuable information was going into the back end of the campaigns. And that kind of takes us to this notion of micro-targeting. And micro-targeting has been around in election campaigns for probably a decade at this stage to one degree or another, but it's really only starting to find its way into advocacy to a greater extent. And it's finding that in partnership with all those other data mining tactics that are coming to the forefront. So, for example, you may have heard about Ted Cruz's campaign had a team of statistic experts and behavioral psychologists on board who could psychographically target and deliver tailored messages to you according to your interests. And to see how that is being used in advocacy to a somewhat lesser extent, but to kind of equal success, we have the example of the National Corn Growers here. And the National Corn Growers Association is a trade association with 40,000 members nationwide. I think they have 48 affiliated state organizations. And so, not surprisingly, most of their members are in corn-growing states. And so, as you might expect, their members are heavily impacted by new laws and existing regulations that get changed, or even trade deals, things like that. So being able to mobilize grassroots on all of those fronts is critical to helping them advance their members' interests. And last year, to 2016, they were facing a couple of different challenges, but one big reoccurring one was with the renewable fuel standards, which was particularly important to their organization and their members. And so the EPA was proposing to reduce the minimum level of biofuels to be blended in gasoline, and obviously this would have huge economic effects on the National Corn Growers members. And so in response, they realized they would have to mobilize their members to take action and comment on this regulation on regulations.gov, and do it in that compressed open comment period that follows each proposal. So that was all fine, except this was the third year running that they'd be asking their members for pretty much the same action on the same issue. And like any campaign, they were kind of experiencing a bit of issue fatigue with this. And so while they knew that they could rely on a bunch of their members to engage and take action for them, they also wanted to reach more folks to do so, because they felt that if the EPA could hear from the broader public about this issue, it would have more of an impact than if it was just from the usual, I'm a corn grower in blah, blah, blah. So they wanted to kind of reach people in unlikely states, you know, California, Nevada, Massachusetts, Florida, way outside the Corn Belt, in order to have that greater impact. So how could they go about doing this? Well, they decided to go with CQ's Advocate Acquisition Program, which is a tool that we offer here. And they wanted to aim this at non-members, you know, and to try and make a connection beyond the issues with folks who wouldn't be their normal audience. So a good advocate acquisition tool will let you micro-target geographically, as well as sort of pinpoint demographics like age or gender or political persuasion and so forth. And initially, the National Corn Growers Association came up with a small list of states that they wanted to reach outside their traditional membership. But then they decided they would open up the campaign nationwide. So before they did that, they decided on 3 messages that they hoped would appeal to 3 different demographics. And those 3 messages were on energy security and people kind of worried about the Middle East, or who might be military focused and who might would most likely lean conservative. The second one was for people who paid little attention, or who paid attention to the clean air message, and who would more likely lean left. They might be, they might fit that soccer mom profile or have young children. And then the third one was more of a hybrid, and it was about saving money at the pump, which they presumed would be good for everyone. So how an advocate acquisition program like this works is potential new supporters are shown an ad online based on those demographics we mentioned, while they're browsing or reading sites that are already kind of part of their daily routines. And then the specific ad that they see, the clean air, cost at the pump, energy security, is mapped to their profile. And once they see this ad, they're brought to a landing page where they'll see a letter that the National Corn Growers Association had crafted to comment on the EPA. So once they get to that letter, they know that they're taking action for the National Corn Growers Association. There's nothing kind of untoward or in any way hidden about that. And also on the page is a form where they fill out their name and address and email and their contact information, obviously, so that then the National Corn Growers can use them to reach out to in a future campaign. So they went ahead and they did that, and the results were pretty phenomenal, to be honest. 10 days in, the National Corn Growers Association had captured 38,404 non-member advocates, and by capture we mean they had them take action for them. They had commented on regulations.gov, which is a huge number, obviously, and it's almost as many as their entire membership. And maybe more surprising is that this is a group who would not traditionally be sympathetic to the corn growers' message. Another notable fact was that one message resonated above all. The corn growers had thought that the message about saving at the pump would would be the one that would really kind of bring in all these advocates. But the one that performed better than all the others was actually the Clean Air one. So even better was that it just took them 10 days to get all these comments captured, and they finished a week ahead of deadline, on which the deadline was July 11th, and they came in a week early last year. So they went from a dead start to 38,000 plus comments in just 10 days. So great result for the National Corn Growers, and again, a good example of how micro-targeting can really move the ball forward in advocacy and on finding new folks for your grassroots. Now, another way you can reliably kind of predict the future, and a way you can do it now if you have an advocacy software, is with segmentation. So we're all familiar with that old maxim, the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. And when it comes to advocacy, that's true too. So everyone wants to think that they've got this, reliable core group of supporters they can go to take action when something big comes up in legislation or with a regulation, without having to start from scratch. And that's where good advocacy tools can really help you get deep into the weeds by looking at people's past behavior. If you can segment your lists by zip code matching, or people who took action within a certain date range, or took action on a specific engagement, or clicked in an email, or by the minimum number of actions they took, you can really get some of that big data we mentioned earlier. That means you can kind of grasp what people are likely to do in the future. And that will give you kind of better advocacy predictions for your campaigns. You can also identify your super advocates. Your super advocates are that top 20% who reliably take action for you whenever you ask. And obviously those are the people you kind of want on speed dial, so to speak. You can make a note of your graph tops. Some organizations do a really good job of this. They will take kind of detailed notes when they are acquiring a new member. And so they'll identify kind of what their relationships are with people that might be useful to them in the future. A lot of your membership is likely, or at least a part of your membership is likely to maybe know a congressman. They may have gone to school with one. They may have some kind of influence that would be really valuable to your organization in the future. And most people, particularly in trade organizations, are very willing to take action, or in issue-based organizations too. They're a member of your organization for a reason, and so they're generally pretty happy to help you out. It'll also help you find under-engaged members or donors, and these are the ones obviously not likely to renew next year. And there are some solid metrics behind kind of why you should segment, from HubSpot here, who are a giant marketing software company, and they found in a study that they ran that when people segmented their lists, 39% experienced higher open rates, 28% experienced lower unsubscribe rates, and 24% experienced better deliverability and greater revenue. And obviously we could all do with those improved rates, whatever industry we're in. So all of this makes you much better informed to predict kind of the likely outcome of any advocacy campaign you want to run. And in turn, that lets you sort of pick your policy battles. If you see that there isn't much appetite or interest in certain areas that maybe your organization has been pouring time or resources into, you'll have data to back it up, and you can pivot those resources into something else that maybe members or supporters are much more concerned about. And ultimately, that will kind of create better member engagement and better retention rates for your organization. So that's about it. We hope you learned something today. And as always, if you have any questions, please reach out to me. My email is anndermody@cqrollcall.com. I'll be sending out a link to the webinar to follow up, along with some of the resources I mentioned there. So thank you, everyone. Have a great day.